So with Beat Detective, you have to be very careful with some steps. If you overlook a detail, then it can mess up everything very badly. So, but if you follow the steps and if you follow every procedure attentively, then it can work like a charm and save you a lot of time. So I recommend working with sections at a time. So I'm going to start with the section between bar 2 and bar 10, right? So 8 bars. So I'm going to change my grid resolution to quarter note right now. And the reason I'm doing that is because my selection before I use Beat Detective, it has to be either beats or bars. It cannot be eighth notes, it cannot be sixteenths, and so on. Nothing smaller than a quarter note. So I'm going to go to quarter note here, and I'm going to select one beat before my first transient, and I'm going to go all the way to bar 10. There you go. So, and I can see my selection here. It starts at bar 1, beat 4, and it ends at bar 10, beat 1. I have to make sure that nothing populates here. This third column, it has to be filled by zeros. If it's not filled by zeros, that means that I have my selection is not starting and ending at a bar or a beat. It has a little bit of extra something, and then Beat Detective is not going to work. So I do that. I separate, and then I press Command 8 to pull up the Beat Detective window. There you go. So Beat Detective has 5 different functionalities. I'm only going to be using the last 3. So I'm going to start with clip separation. The first thing that I need to do is capture the selection. And when it captures the selection, it updates here, and I need to make sure that they are exactly the same. So my Pro Tool selection, which is 14000 through 101000, has to be the same as it shows in Beat Detective, and it's 14101. The time signature is 44 in this case. So once I've captured the selection, I need to update the contains, and the contains is the smallest rhythm figure. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to change the grid resolution so that I have one grid line per sonic event or per transient. So right now it's quarter note, and I can see that this transient does not have a grid line to it. So I'm just going to switch to eighth note, and now I have a grid line for it. So it seems that my smallest rhythm figure is an eighth note, but let's keep searching for it. So I'm just going to go through this real quick, and okay, eighth note it is. And now I'm going to update that, so contains 8 notes, so that was correct already. Once I do that, I'm going to click on Analyze. All right. And then I'm going to increase the sensitivity. And I want to make sure that I have one purple line for every transient. Sometimes if you have your sensitivity too high, it starts adding fake transients, so those are not good. So make sure that your sensitivity is the lowest possible value. That includes all the transients. So about 46% is good here. It's including all the transients. Also, your resolution, since it contains eighth notes, which is already a subbeat, you need to make sure that subbeat is selected. So the trigger pad. If my trigger pad is 0 and I click on separate, Beat Detective is going to separate my clip at the beginning, right at the beginning of every transient. The problem with that is that later when I add crossfades, that crossfade may overlap with the beginning of the transient, making them sound a little muffled. So I'm going to add a little bit of trigger pad, and usually 10 milliseconds works for drums. So I'm going to type in 10 there, and I'm going to separate. Oops, it didn't go through because I didn't press enter after typing 10. So make sure to do that. So I'm going to click on separate, and you see that the separation happens a little bit before the purple line. So that is going to give me enough leeway to add a crossfade later on. So that's important. So usually 10 milliseconds works for most drummings. All right. Now that I have everything separated, I'm going to move on to the next step, which is conform. Now, you need to keep the selection intact. If you click somewhere in the window, you're going to lose your selection. And then Beat Detective is not going to work. If you lose your selection because you clicked somewhere, there's a good shortcut that restores the last selection, which is very useful. And that shortcut is Option Command Z. So it restores the previous selection. It's very useful when using Beat Detective. So now I'm going to go ahead and go to Conform. And Beat Detective has all these functions. One of them is strength. So the strength is the degree at which Beat Detective is going to move the transient towards the closest grid line. So 100% means that if the transient is 10 milliseconds off, 10 milliseconds to the sides of the grid line, it's going to move it to the grid line, right? But if the strength is 70%, then it's only going to move 7 milliseconds towards the grid line, but it's not going to put it right at the grid line. So this allows you to control the degree at which you're going to tighten up the performance. So if the drumming is really good and you just want to make it a little bit tighter, sometimes values of between 30 and 70% are good. But if you want to make it 100% on the grid, as some genres ask for, then you want to make it 100%. Now, exclude within and swing are also related to this preservation of the natural feel of the drumming, but they're kind of tricky to use. Just as a brief overview, exclude within means that if the transient is just like 10% off where it should be, Beat Detective is not going to do anything with it. But as soon as it is off by a value greater than 10%, then it's going to move it towards the grid according to the strength parameter. But we're not going to use that. And the swing is if your drumming has a lot of triplets. So triplets, as you know, it's like when you have 3 notes per every beat. So ta 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 ta. So if your drums pattern has tuplets, then you can preserve those tuplets by adjusting the swing parameter. So this is kind of rare, and usually when a song has tuplets, I'm probably going to edit it manually instead of using Beat Detective, just because it can be a little bit complicated. But you can give it a try if you ever find yourself in the situation of editing a rhythm pattern that has tuplets. But for now, let's just use strength. And I'm going to be very aggressive here, and I'm going to set the strength to 100%. I'm going to click on Conform. Boom. So now my transient that was off the grid is now perfectly on the grid. And that happened to all the transients. And as an artifact, I created several gaps. So the beauty of it is that I can fix those gaps with the next step, which is the edit smoothing. And I have 2 options here, just fill the gaps and also fill the gaps and crossfade. Fill the gaps and crossfade makes the most sense, of course. And usually for drums, a very short crossfade works better. So my crossfade is going to be 5 milliseconds here, and I just click on smooth. So it filled in the gaps automatically and also place the crossfades. So let's go ahead and listen to it. Perfect. So now it's 100% on the grid.